Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Before we begin tonight, I want you to pause, just for a moment, and reflect on the journey that brought you here. Every life in this room carries a story of decisions made and decisions avoided, of doors opened and doors left closed, of courage shown and courage postponed. Some of you arrived here confident, some arrived searching, some arrived tired, some arrived hopeful. But all of us arrived shaped by choice. America is a nation built on choice, the choice to cross oceans, the choice to dream beyond circumstance, the choice to challenge systems, the choice to reinvent oneself. We are a people who speak often of freedom, freedom of speech, freedom of belief, freedom of opportunity. But freedom is not merely the ability to choose. Freedom is the responsibility to choose well. And that responsibility becomes most visible not in grand historic moments, but in quiet, ordinary ones. The kinds of moments that never make headlines but determine the trajectory of a life. We live in an era defined by convenience. Groceries arrive at our doors. Information arrives in seconds. Entertainment never ends. Opinions travel faster than reflection. Discomfort can be muted, delayed, distracted, or medicated. And yet, despite unprecedented comfort, anxiety is high. Despite endless connection, loneliness persists. Despite limitless opportunity, many feel stuck. Why? Because the greatest battles are no longer fought on battlefields. They are fought within our discipline, within our character, within our willingness to confront what is hard instead of defaulting to what is easy. Tonight is not about productivity. It is not about hustle culture. It is not about glorifying exhaustion. Tonight is about awareness. It is about understanding a quiet force that shapes nations, organizations, families, and individual destinies. A force so subtle we rarely name it. So common, we barely notice it. So influential, it determines who we become. We are here to examine that force, to confront it honestly, to understand it deeply, and to decide, consciously, how it will shape the rest of our lives. Because whether we acknowledge it or not, it is shaping us already. Tonight, we will talk about something simple, yet powerful. Something natural, yet dangerous. Something comforting, yet limiting. Tonight, we will talk about the path of least resistance. Tonight, I want to speak to you about something that shapes every life in this room, whether we recognize it or not. It whispers to us in moments of exhaustion. It seduces us in moments of fear. It disguises itself as comfort, as convenience, even as wisdom. I want to speak to you about the path of least resistance. In America, we celebrate strength. We admire grit. We build monuments to perseverance. We tell stories about pioneers crossing plains, about entrepreneurs building empires in garages, about activists marching across bridges in the face of dogs and fire hoses. And yet, if we are honest, every single one of us knows the quiet tug of the easier way, the shorter line, the softer answer, the delayed decision, the comfortable lie, the path of least resistance. Now here's the paradox. The path of least resistance is not always wrong. In nature, it is simply the way things move. Water flows downhill. Electricity travels through the most conductive material. Rivers carve valleys not through force, but through persistence along the easiest channel. But human beings are not rivers. We are not electricity. We are not bound to gravity. We are endowed with choice. And in that choice lies destiny. When we were children, we learned quickly that effort is uncomfortable. Learning to walk meant falling. Learning to read meant struggling. Learning to make friends meant risking rejection. But at some point, many of us stopped embracing discomfort as growth and started avoiding it as danger. We chose silence instead of speaking up. We chose distraction instead of discipline. We chose certainty instead of curiosity. And little by little, the path of least resistance began shaping us. Not dramatically, not catastrophically, but quietly. Because the path of least resistance rarely destroys you overnight. It erodes you gradually. It convinces you that good enough is good enough. It persuades you that later is soon enough. It tells you that someone else will do it. And in a country as powerful and dynamic as the United States, that erosion can happen invisibly. We have comforts previous generations could not imagine. Instant entertainment, instant food, instant opinions, instant outrage. But growth is never instant. Character is never instant. Purpose is never instant. And so the question before us tonight is not whether the path of least resistance exists. It always will. The question is, when does it serve us and when does it steal from us? Let me tell you a story. There was a young man who dreamed of becoming a physician. He was bright. He was capable. He came from a family that believed in him. But organic chemistry was hard. The late nights were hard. Watching his friends relax while he studied was hard. And so he began to cut corners. He skimmed instead of mastering. He memorized instead of understanding. He passed, but barely. Years later, in a hospital room, he stood over a patient whose life depended on knowledge he once chose not to fully earn. That is the true cost of the path of least resistance. It rarely charges you immediately. It bills you later, with interest. And this is not just about medicine or careers. It's about relationships. How many marriages have unraveled not because of one explosive betrayal, but because of 1,000 small avoidances? The hard conversation not had, the apology not given, the vulnerability not shared. It was easier to scroll than to speak, easier to withdraw than to risk rejection, easier to assume than to ask. The path of least resistance in relationships is emotional distance. And emotional distance over time becomes loneliness, even in the same room. Now, let's widen the lens. America was not built on the path of least resistance. The abolition of slavery was not the path of least resistance. The fight for women's suffrage was not the path of least resistance. The civil rights movement was not the path of least resistance. The path of least resistance would have been silence. The path of least resistance would have been compliance. The path of least resistance would have been, that's just the way things are. But progress is born when someone decides that comfort is less important than conscience. And here is where this message becomes deeply personal. Because you may not be leading a movement, you may not be standing at a podium in Washington, you may not be writing legislation or marching across bridges, but every single day, in small unseen moments, you are choosing your path. When your alarm rings at 5 a.m., when temptation knocks, when criticism stings, when fear whispers, you are choosing. Now, let me clarify something important. Choosing resistance does not mean choosing unnecessary suffering. This is not about glorifying burnout. This is not about grinding yourself into dust. This is not about proving your worth through exhaustion. Sometimes the path of least resistance is actually wisdom. If you are holding on to resentment, the hardest thing may feel like forgiving, but forgiveness might be the path of least resistance for your soul. If you are trapped in pride, the hardest thing may feel like apologizing, but humility might be the path of least resistance for your growth. Resistance is not always external. Sometimes the true resistance is internal, against ego, against fear, against insecurity, and that is where the deepest battles are fought. Consider the athlete training for the Olympics. Every muscle aches. Every morning demands discipline. Every meal requires intention. The easier path is obvious. Skip the workout. Indulge the craving. Sleep in. But the athlete understands something profound. What feels like resistance today becomes strength tomorrow. What feels uncomfortable now becomes capability later. In America, we love underdog stories. We love comeback stories. We love transformation stories. But what we often forget is that transformation is a series of small resistances chosen consistently over time. It is saying no to what diminishes you. It is saying yes to what develops you. It is choosing long-term meaning over short-term comfort. Let's talk about fear. Fear is the architect of the path of least resistance. Fear says, don't apply, you might be rejected. Don't start, you might fail. Don't speak, you might offend. Don't try, you might look foolish. Fear's favorite word is might. But destiny's favorite word is become. And the only way to become is to move through resistance. Not around it. Not under it. Through it. I have met people who avoided risk their entire lives. They avoided heartbreak by avoiding love. They avoided failure by avoiding ambition. They avoided embarrassment by avoiding authenticity. And in the end, they avoided living. Because the path of least resistance can protect you from pain. But it can also protect you from purpose. There is a difference between ease and alignment. Ease is what feels comfortable. Alignment is what feels right. Sometimes alignment is incredibly uncomfortable. Speaking truth may disrupt a room. Changing careers may disrupt stability. Setting boundaries may disrupt approval. But alignment brings peace that ease never can. In a culture obsessed with convenience, alignment requires courage. And courage is not the absence of fear. It is the decision that something else matters more. Now, let's make this practical. How do we recognize when we are drifting into the path of least resistance? Ask yourself 3 questions. 1. Is this choice expanding me or shrinking me? 2. Am I acting from purpose or from avoidance? 3. If everyone followed this example, what kind of world would it create? These questions cut through excuses because the path of least resistance often disguises itself as rationality. I deserve this. It's not that important. It won't make a difference. But repeated daily, these small rationalizations shape character, and character shapes destiny. In boardrooms across America, decisions are made that affect millions. Sometimes the easier decision boosts quarterly profits. The harder decision protects long-term integrity. The path of least resistance may satisfy shareholders today. The path of responsibility builds trust for generations. History is full of companies that chose ease over ethics and paid dearly. History is also full of leaders who endured criticism, financial loss, even ridicule, because they chose principle over convenience. And time vindicated them. Let's bring this home. What is the path of least resistance in your life right now? Is it staying in a job that drains you because change feels risky? Is it staying silent about injustice because speaking feels uncomfortable? Is it neglecting your health because discipline feels inconvenient? Is it holding on to bitterness because letting go feels vulnerable? The path of least resistance will always be available, but the path of greatest growth must be chosen. I want to challenge a myth tonight. The myth that happiness comes from minimizing friction. The truth is, happiness comes from meaningful struggle. The parent waking at night for a crying baby is exhausted, but fulfilled. The entrepreneur risking everything for a vision is anxious, but alive. The activist standing for justice is afraid, but purposeful. Friction is not the enemy. Meaningless friction is. When friction serves a purpose greater than comfort, it becomes fuel. There is a powerful image in nature. When a butterfly struggles to emerge from its cocoon, that struggle pushes fluid into its wings. If someone cuts the cocoon to help it, the butterfly emerges weak, unable to fly. The struggle is not cruelty. The struggle is preparation. If you remove all resistance from your life, you remove the very force that strengthens you. America's greatest moments came not from ease, but from endurance. Your greatest moments will be no different. But let me be compassionate here. Some of you are tired. Some of you have been resisting for a long time, fighting for your family, fighting for your health, fighting for your dreams. And you may be thinking, I don't need more resistance. I need relief. And that is fair. There is a difference between chosen resistance and imposed suffering. Chosen resistance builds you. Unnecessary suffering depletes you. Wisdom is knowing the difference. You are not required to fight every battle. You are not required to prove yourself endlessly. You are not required to carry burdens that are not yours. Sometimes the most courageous act is to lay something down. Sometimes the path of least resistance is actually surrender. Surrendering ego, surrendering control, surrendering what no longer serves you. But surrender is not the same as avoidance. Surrender is conscious. Avoidance is unconscious. So where does this leave us? It leaves us with responsibility. You cannot control the economy. You cannot control global events. You cannot control every outcome, but you can control your direction. Every day, you are either building strength or building excuses. You are either cultivating discipline or cultivating delay. You are either stepping toward your calling or stepping away from it. And over years, those steps compound. A degree is earned one class at a time. A marriage is built one conversation at a time. A nation is shaped one decision at a time. Destiny is not dramatic. It is cumulative. Imagine if every person in this room committed to one thing, choosing the harder right over the easier wrong, in business, in family, in citizenship, in character, not perfectly, but consistently. Imagine the ripple effect. Children would grow up seeing integrity modeled, communities would see courage normalized, workplaces would see excellence elevated, and slowly, quietly, culture would shift. Because culture is nothing more than collective habits, and habits are nothing more than repeated choices. Let me leave you with this image. Picture 2 paths in a forest. One is wide, smooth, and crowded. It requires little thought. It asks nothing of you. The other is narrow, uneven, and uncertain. It demands attention. It demands effort. It demands faith. The wide path promises comfort. The narrow path promises growth. One leads to familiarity. The other leads to transformation. The path of least resistance will always call your name, but so will your potential. And potential has a quieter voice. It does not shout. It invites. It says, you are capable of more. You were made for more. You can endure more. You can become more. America does not need more comfort. It needs more courage. Families do not need more convenience. They need more commitment. You do not need an easier life. You need a meaningful one. And meaning is found where resistance meets purpose. So tomorrow morning, when the alarm rings, when the conversation feels uncomfortable, when the temptation feels strong, when the fear feels loud, pause and ask yourself, is this the path of least resistance? Or is this the path that will make me stronger, wiser, truer? Then choose, not based on comfort, but on character. Choose not based on fear, but on faith. Choose not based on ease, but on alignment. Because in the end, your life will not be measured by how comfortable you were. It will be measured by how courageously you lived. The path of least resistance is easy, but the path of purpose is worth it. And now, as we come to the end of this reflection, I want to leave you not with pressure, but with clarity. The path of least resistance is not evil. It is not dramatic. It is not always obvious. It is simply human. We are wired to conserve energy. We are wired to avoid pain. We are wired to seek safety. There is no shame in that. But there is consequence in never rising above it. Your life will not be defined by the moments when everything was easy. It will be defined by the moments when you faced what was difficult and stepped forward anyway. When you spoke, though your voice trembled. When you stayed committed, though you felt tired. When you forgave, though you were hurt. When you tried again, though you had failed. That is where identity is forged. Years from now, you will not remember the comfortable shortcuts. You will remember the courageous decisions. You will remember the risk you took, the apology you gave, the boundary you set, the discipline you kept, the dream you pursued when it would have been easier to quit. That is the architecture of a meaningful life. And here's the beautiful truth. You do not have to transform everything tonight. You do not have to fix every weakness tomorrow. You do not have to conquer every fear this year. You only have to choose consciously, one decision at a time, one conversation, one morning, one temptation, one act of integrity. Over time, those small acts become momentum. Momentum becomes character. Character becomes influence. Influence becomes legacy. And legacy is not what you leave behind when you die. It is what you build into others while you live. If you are a parent, your children are watching your choices. If you are a leader, your team is watching your standards. If you are a citizen, your community is watching your participation. If you are a friend, someone is watching your loyalty. Courage is contagious, but so is complacency. Which will you spread? Imagine a country where more people chose growth over ease, where more leaders chose integrity over convenience, where more families chose communication over avoidance, where more individuals chose purpose over comfort. That transformation would not begin in Washington. It would begin in living rooms, in workplaces, in classrooms, in mirrors. It would begin with you, because ultimately, the path of least resistance is not about roads in a forest. It is about daily decisions in the heart. You stand at a crossroads more often than you realize. Sometimes it feels small, sometimes invisible, sometimes insignificant. But compounded over time, those crossroads shape destiny. And destiny is not something that happens to you. It is something you build quietly, persistently, courageously, through the choices you make when no one is watching. So walk out of this room not burdened, but awakened. Not overwhelmed, but intentional. Not pressured, but empowered. The easy path will always be there, but so will the higher one. May you have the wisdom to recognize the difference. May you have the strength to endure necessary resistance. May you have the humility to surrender what no longer serves you. And may you build a life not defined by comfort, but by courage, integrity, and purpose. Thank you. And may your choices lead you somewhere worthy of who you are becoming.